If workers in a factory are more worried about making sure that a trans employee doesn't get the rights they deserve or don't care about that trans employee when they get attacked, why should those workers care about a Black employee or a Jewish employee or an immigrant employee? It really creates a wedge within the movement that can be used to separate us, to get people to not understand that our problem is the billionaires and multimillionaires in charge of our country, not LGBTQ plus children or trans people who want the same thing that every working class person wants, to not be exploited and oppressed.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and today we have our show is about another of Donald Trump's attacks on people and on the people's movements. We're going to be talking today about the LGBTQ plus movement, but especially the trans movement and the attacks that Donald Trump and the far right have been waging actually against trans people for quite some time. We have the perfect guest to do this. We have the president of the Tallahassee Community Action Committee, Delilah Pierre, who's also been an organizer, I should say, with around police crimes, and she's worked on LGBTQ plus movements and in the movement for some time, and and somebody from Florida who's been seeing the DeSantis craziness for a little bit longer than some of us in some other states possibly. So welcome to Fight Back Radio, Delilah.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for welcoming me.
Yes, it's great to have you. So I want to start with a little bit of pre-Trump though, and it's the attack. It seemed like we were on a streak and getting more rights for a decade or more for women and LGBTQ plus people, but there's been a reversal, and it's not something that just started, and maybe if you can talk a little bit, not just about Florida, but Florida for sure, and other states, because I think it's mostly the state level where these attacks have been coming down, and there's been a rollback of some of the gains that had previously been made.
Yeah, I think there's been a serious attack on the entire LGBTQ plus movement, but especially on trans people within that movement. And I think we've seen it most clearly with states like Florida and Texas and Ron DeSantis, whether that was DeSantis a few years back passing a bill making it illegal for trans women to play within women's sports in schools, passing bills making it more difficult to access gender-affirming care, passing a bill that makes it so that only a doctor could prescribe gender-affirming care instead of a registered nurse, making it far more difficult to access for people in different places in Florida. For instance, I can only go to the Planned Parenthood in Florida to get gender-affirming care because I went there before that bill was passed, because I've been transitioning for years. If you're a trans person and you live in Tallahassee, too bad. You've got to find another Planned Parenthood to go to because their capacity is at max, because of how difficult it is to, process new people. So Florida, I think, has really been a vanguard of attacks on trans people in particular, but LGBTQ plus people generally. Our state has kind of like set this paradigm where sometimes they go with an active attack on us. Sometimes it's even an economic factor that makes covering transition very difficult. Like in Florida, a bill has passed that makes it so that if you transition, your health insurance company has to cover the entire cost if you decide to detransition. And so what this is actually effectively doing, right, in practice is it's giving these companies and organizations an incentive to not put gender-affirming care as health insurance, to not make it a health insurance policy, and to make access to gender-affirming care more difficult. But in Texas, we've seen similarly dangerous and disturbing bills. For instance, the governor basically advocating for, trans parents to be searched and reviewed by the state government, basically accusing them of doing child abuse, literally just for being trans and being parents. So it's something that we've seen mostly in the South, but we see kind of like copycat bills like this going all around the country. And of course, Donald Trump and his administration has brought this up to the highest level of office. But if we're being real and honest, the Democrats haven't exactly been very forward for trans rights. And it was very disappointing, I will say, to see Kamala's lack of recognition for the trans community and her basic refusal to say openly that she supports gender affirming care.
Okay, well, we're going to dig into some of that stuff, and I appreciate that. But I want to go back a little bit here to, Florida and some of the other states and what's been going on there. And you gave us a little bit of an outline, but how has the community responded to all this? I think it's you give us a little bit of a taste, at the state level of what we might see nationally coming up.
I think there's been a lot of outrage and a lot more mobilization among like LGBTQ plus rights. I think it's kind of like, shocked a lot of people out of this dormancy where I think people have this idea that the way things change is, it was just going to slowly continue to get better for gay and trans people until discrimination dissolved away. But I think people are understanding that no, we have to fight and struggle and organize for our rights. And we've seen a lot more activity around LGBTQ plus issues, specifically, around the death of Next Benedict, a trans child who was killed in a school bathroom. And also we've seen people mobilize around LGBTQ plus issues, even though we thought we wouldn't get as much mobilization. For instance, we had a protest against this conservative organization that was going to protest a drag show happening at this place called Common Ground Books in Tallahassee. And even though we didn't even put the flyer out for the protest until the day of, 80 people came out to support the protest and attend. So I think, the queer and trans community, we're mobilized. We want to do something. We want to change some things. We have a lot of solidarity between our allies. And I think although obviously there are a lot of people who have transphobic and homophobic ideas, about people, bad ideas, or sometimes treat trans people badly, treat LGBTQ plus people badly. I think really on a major level, there's only a vocal minority of people who truly hate us, who are truly organizing against us. They even did a study on it, and it shows that most people are indifferent because people just don't really care that much. They might have, maybe a negative view about a queer or trans person, but I don't think people really understand the scope of our oppression. And even though those bills have been passed, I don't think it's what people care about primarily. I think there's just a small section of the most reactionary base of Trump supporters and DeSantis supporters who are cheering over that, while everyone else asks why their egg prices are getting higher and why the economy is getting worse.
Yeah. Well, and this is an old tactic. These wedge issues, as they call them. It goes. I think Karl Rove during the Bush years became famous for trying to, and using marriage equality as a way to try to divide the Democratic Party. But let me get into some of these things about. You talked about gender affirming care. And, there's been we just had a protest here in Chicago 2 days ago because one of the hospitals here is stopping to giving a gender affirming care because they're afraid of losing federal funds. And it was endorsed by the Chicago Teachers Union, which was kind of a big deal because it's a big union and it has a lot of strength. And I'm a member of that union, so I'm very proud of that. But also, a lot of teachers were saying how important gender affirming care is, for minors, even because of the way it affects people, psychologically, and in their ability to learn, or even their ability to have a healthy life and to a healthy, the people, so people go into depressions and there's suicides and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about gender affirming care and what that is, why is that important, and what these threats are to it?
Yeah, I think gender affirming care is primarily care for transgender people who are facing gender dysphoria. So if you're a trans person, you experience this kind of dysphoria, this kind of out of placeness with your body, so to speak, in my personal experience, being someone who was assigned male at birth, being a trans woman, having access to gender affirming care, I think saved my life, saved me from being in a depressive state, and just allowed me to be my fullest self, to be actually I always say a real person in front of people. And I think that's where gender affirming care gets for trans people. It's really life or death for us. If you don't have access to transition, You know what I mean? You experience high rates of depression. You have this like inability to be yourself in social spaces. You lose so much of your life when you can't transition. You have to sacrifice so much of your life being someone that you're not being able to express your fullest self. And so, gender affirming care, I think, matters to a lot of trans people because of that. But it's also something that cisgender people have access to as well, because cisgender people also use gender affirming care as well. You know what I mean? Whether that's, someone who has PCOS or someone who has some kind of condition that makes it so that they don't fit into like their assigned gender at birth, they also access gender affirming care and use it. You know what I mean? There's just one that's acceptable and one that isn't. So these attacks on gender affirming care, it's really a life or death situation that people are attacking. They're taking away people's fundamental right to have control over their own bodies, to have bodily autonomy. And they're increasing the already like insanely high suicide rates in the trans community, rates of depression and the LGBTQ plus community. It's something, it's a democratic right that we've struggled for, and we need to continue to struggle for and win again. Because, many trans people in our country fear a total federal ban on gender affirming care for minors, or even just for everyone, or for everyone up to the age of 25. And this would endanger so many people's lives. It's basically creating a public health crisis for no reason, just like how the Trump administration is trying to take away HIV medication from people and create another health crisis that we've already solved.
Yeah, no, it's and we're going to go through a list of some of the attacks here, but I mean, it just seems particularly cruel, if and for no apparent reason, to be doing the kinds of things he has doing, and you're right. It's I think if we take this out to folks, and we have to, I think we'll get support. I really do. But at least we won't get the kind of negative reactions. I think that group, as you said, is relatively small. But I want to go through some of the other things too, though. Here, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about athletics and people, whether you play on the men's team or the women's team and stuff like that. Could you talk a little bit about that and what's really the debate here?
So in reality, when we talk about trans athletes, there are 40 trans athletes in the NCAA. You know what I mean? Like, they're not a huge portion of the sport. More than that, you know what I mean? I feel like people think like trans people, being in the Olympics, being in these sporting competitions is like is a super new, brand new thing. They've been letting trans people into the Olympics since 2004 because they've created a scientific process to determine whether someone, has gone through a process in their hormones for it to be quote unquote fair for that person to participate in the sport. But it's not about the science of it. It's not about making sports quote unquote fair for women, especially considering the fact that all the people who say this don't care about, making sure that women have equal pay in sports, or avoid sexual harassment in sports. It's, I think, about reinforcing gender norms as well as, attacking trans people and kicking them out of one more space of public society. You know what I mean? There's so much of a lack of representation for us, and an inability for us to have access to so many other things. It's why things like Trump's military ban, while on one hand, obviously, we don't want more people joining the military, has affected so many trans people's lives because that's one of the few places that they have access to even getting a job. And in the same way, I think, when trans people can't be in sports, when we can't be in the bathrooms that we want to be in, when we're being attacked and shut away from public life, it makes it easier and easier to exploit us. It makes it easier and easier to paint a picture of us that's negative, to basically, create these stereotypes about us that are untrue and put them in people's mind because no one is seeing any trans people around them. You know what I mean? It's why people think of us as imaginary. We popped out of nowhere. That's not true. The truth is that we've been here for a very long time, forever. You know what I mean? We've been here far longer than capitalism, and we'll be here for longer than capitalism. But the reality of it hasn't come to people's heads because we've been so oppressed and so negatively represented in nearly every sector of social society that we're just now starting to get the right to have, some basic crumbs of accessibility, having a few queer and trans people who are allowed to be publicly successful.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it's there's not a lot of people that the public can see on television, identify with or whatever, and you see the the greatness, the flaws, and everything in between, like all other humans and famous people. And so yes, you mentioned the military, and I know you're not a supporter of U.S. Military actions around the world and U.S. imperialism. So how do you as a trans woman who supports the movement, how do you address this thing where Trump is kicking trans people out of the military and saying that they have no place here?
That's a really great question. I mean, personally, I'm not complaining about not having to serve the military. You know what I mean? You don't have to tell me twice. If you don't want me to go, just tell me the day, time, you know what I mean? Because I wasn't going to take that draft anyway. But obviously, this is negatively impacting and affecting a lot of trans people's lives. I think we should be organizing those people. We should be rallying around those people, you know what I mean? Like, and saying, look at this system that we live in that has affected you, that has thrown you out on the street, even though you served it and fought for it, just because you're transgender. These are the kind of people we can organize and have join our mass movement. These are the kind of people we need to join our mass movement, to have it be stronger, to build a stronger anti-war movement, to build a stronger movement for LGBTQ plus rights. I feel ambivalent as to like what kind of energy we should put into fighting for, LGBTQ plus people to have the right to join the military. But I do think like it is a democratic right, just not one that I think is like particularly the most important for the movement. But, it's something to consider.
Yeah. I mean, we had these same debates back in the late 70s, early 80s, when there was a question of whether women should be in the military. And, we were supporting women's rights and women's equality. But the military was another thing. And, looking back on it, I think, you have to say, we support full equality for people, for everyone across the board. And, I think it's, maybe help change some minds of people, having women in the military. But the U.S. military obviously has played a terrible role in many places in the world, and in terms of suppressing and oppressing the democratic rights of other countries. So whether it's men doing it, women, or whether they're LGBTQ or not, it's the same. Whatever. It's not something we support, I don't think. But yeah, let me move on though. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the issues that they're talking about people, whether using what name you can use, that you have to use the name that you were given at birth, or some of the stuff with passports that only given two genders, and some of this stuff affects different parts of the LGBT Q plus community. But if you could talk a little bit about marriage equality as well, some of these issues and how they affect the movement, and how it affects our organizing, and what's important now, and how we should be positioning ourselves to fight against this kind of oppression.
Yeah, we absolutely have to stand fully firm for trans people to have the right to use their real names. We call them our chosen names, you know what I mean, on our legal IDs and government IDs, for us to be able to have the sex represented on our legal IDs that is representative of us. For me, that would be female, you know what I mean? It's really this passport issue. It's an issue of political respect and of being treated as the same kind of person as everyone else, as having the same fundamental democratic rights as everyone else. And having a passport or having, a government ID that isn't indicative of who you really are can endanger people's lives. You know what I mean? A lot of people say, oh, I can always tell if it's a trans person. You can't. Sometimes you can't tell if it's a trans man or a trans woman. You know what I mean? Many people are able to pass completely. But then you have a government ID that is totally not representative of the person you are, and that's extremely dangerous for your life, especially if you're going to an area with anti-LGBTQ plus bias. It like is kind of like a signal to people, oh, we should discriminate against this person. We should oppress this person. You know, it always makes you pretty much a second-class citizen. It allows people to know that they can treat you differently because you don't have the same rights as everyone else. And, you know, I think in general, this also connects to like Overfedge v. Hodges, you know what I mean? And goes to kind of like this aspect of discrimination.
So that's marriage equality decision of the Supreme Court. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Yes, like marriage equality, it's something that passed in 2015. Like it's extremely recent. And I think people think it can't be targeted. Like I had someone tell me that they think marriage equality won't be targeted because it's, you know, like affecting white men, but I don't agree at all. I think that, you know, they would push back rights for all LGBTQ plus people. You know, it's both like a political right for us, like a right to be treated as the same people, to not be treated as second-class citizens, but also it's an economic issue as well, right? You know what I mean? Because if you're not married to your spouse legally, you can't put them on your insurance. You can't get, you know, joint tax credits with them. You have to deal with a lot of issues and problems that another married couple would not be able to. And there's already been conversation, I believe it was in the Idaho Supreme Court, about, you know, making marriage rights, basically making like Overfedge v. Hodges, making marriage equality a states' rights issue, which is doing the same thing as abortion, right? It's giving some states the clearance to ban marriage equality totally, and maybe even put sodomy laws back on the books and try to ban homosexuality entirely in a state. Who knows how that'll be used? Who knows how that'll be utilized? But we know what it does do, right? It gives people the option to be able to openly discriminate against LGBTQ plus people and to exploit them in that way, to know that a trans employee can't leave your company because they don't have anywhere else to go. So if you want to pay them $10 an hour, you'll pay them $10 an hour because they can't go anywhere else. To know that a gay person has to accept only a civil union or accept less rights than another person, and has to, you know, accept the fact that some stores they go to, some places they go to where they want to purchase things, buy things or whatever else, they won't be treated the same. They'll be given higher prices. They can't go to the same stores as other people because they refuse to serve gay and queer people. And so they have to go to a place that's more expensive or a place that's out of the way. It's just something that's going to affect people's lives in every area. And also, I think, really cause people to think it's okay to openly discriminate against trans and queer people, you know, because these legal attacks, they also come with extra legal consequences, right? Yes, there is the legal attack of ridding people of marriage equality, of absolving rights for trans people. But what it also does is it tells the reactionary base that supports Trump, it tells the white supremacists and reactionaries in our country, it's open season on these communities. You can attack them and get away with it. And I think we've seen that even in a recent case, like the death of a Black trans man named Sam Nordquist.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Who is Sam Nordquist? Go ahead.
He's a Black trans man who was recently killed. I believe he was killed in Ontario, New York, and originally lived in Milwaukee. He was killed by four white women, I believe. He was tortured for 5 days. He was tortured for 5 days and then murdered. The police officer he found him said that it was horrific. He'd never seen anything as bad. Nothing like that should ever happen to another person. For me, this is, you know, this is infuriating, and obviously it's sad. It's something we need to grieve over. But for me, this just feels like a political reality. This is the reality that the climate that Trump has created, that the climate that the Republican Party and in some ways the Democratic Party has created. They've created the conditions for people to think that they can get away with this. And I absolutely see them trying to do things like put trans panic laws back in their defense, which basically, you know, legalizes murdering a trans person if they quote unquote tricked you into not being trans. So let's say, like, you know, you hit on a trans woman at the club, you find out she's a trans woman, you kill her. That's okay, because you didn't know she was trans in the first place. These laws have existed on the books, and not only are obviously trans people not represented and discriminated against in many economic and political ways, just the fact that we're poor, so we get less, you know, we get worse legal representation, but it also just gives people an upper edge to be able to justify their murders of queer and trans people, even if it's not related to that situation. That kind of argument can be made.
Yeah, let me pivot to that a little bit. The question of economics that you were starting to talk about, because there is, of course, discrimination in employment and getting hired. And could you talk a little bit about the current state of trans employment and some of the issues that people and difficulties people have getting a job or holding a job, promotion, things like that, and how that's likely to change with we have Trump and we have a Republican that seems to be following him in everything. So far, at least in both houses, the Congress and the Supreme Court, that's geared to overturn whatever liberties we might still have.
It's abysmal. It's terrible. You know what I mean? Like, trans people by far are the least represented in the workforce. Like, about half of us are unemployed, and it's probably an even worse number when it comes to oppressed nationalities, when it comes to Black and brown people in our country and their employment. They pay the highest rents and face some of the most, renting discrimination. And in states like Florida and Texas and others, they're essentially trying to make it, openly legal to discriminate against trans people, encouraging people to discriminate against trans people in the employment process. Like, these federal laws that have existed on the books that Biden made and some others made about protections of gender identity and sex, like, they were nothing really, because they were not being really enforced on a high level. You were still able to discriminate against a trans person. You just had to come up with a different reason. You know what I mean? And usually that person didn't have the access or funding or money, you know what I mean, to hold anyone accountable. I've experienced discrimination and, in Florida with my psychiatrist for being trans, basically. And I didn't really have any choice but to accept it, because my other choice was to go through an arduous and super long legal process that was probably not going to be successful in holding that person accountable anyway. So trans people have, we have some of the worst income equality in the entirety of the United States of America. We have such a difficult time getting jobs. And when we do get jobs, they're the worst jobs. You know what I mean? They say that when you're Black, you're last hired, first fired. Times that by 10. And that's what being a Black trans person is. That's what being a trans oppressed nationality is. And that's what being working class and trans is really. You know what I mean? Because some of the only trans people we see represented anywhere or even able to have the money and resources to transition are academics, lawyers, doctors, etc. But that's not the majority of trans people, right? We're working class people. They're janitors, they're bus drivers, they're school teachers. That's the trans community that needs representation, that needs, economic and political power. And because of this level of discrimination, there are some jobs that are just totally off limits to us. Like, I thought about being a teacher many times, but I want to live in the South, so I can't. I literally cannot be a teacher unless I want to, spend, months searching for the right school in a very, very liberal area enclave that I can go to that might still fire me anyway. There are positions that are totally off limits to us just because we're trans, and people consider us second. And of course, that goes doubly for being Black and brown and trans. Either all of those reasons or one of those reasons will be a reason for someone not to hire you.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I wanted to touch next on the issues that face minors that are trans minors, and particularly, it strikes me that this is maybe similar to sports in the sense that it plays on the ignorance of the general populace. So it's like if it's like there's a reason there's men's and women's sports, and so you think, oh well, if you just put a man in the women's team, what'll happen? And that's ignorant, as you just pointed out. And the same is true, I think, when people look at minors and they think, okay, well, people that are under 18 years of age, it's like there's a certain amount of, you're learning about your sexuality and there's all kinds of questions and And you shouldn't be doing something that'll affect you the rest of your life and blah blah blah. And then there's the questions of even like this has come up. I said it earlier on. I'm in the Chicago Teachers Union here in Chicago, of the laws that say you have to use a certain name for a student in class or whatever. Otherwise, the teacher could lose their job. That kind of thing. And so. So my question is, looking at trans minors, how would you answer some of these things that are coming up, and what would you want to tell, people to try to break down some of this ignorance that I was referring to?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, first and foremost, there's just so much misinformation, right? Like trans minors, they're not getting top surgery or bottom surgery. They're often just literally social transitioning, which just means wearing different clothing, wearing different dresses or such. And then puberty blockers, which puberty blockers essentially exist to basically, prevent, I'd say the growth of hormones in people's bodies. So like basically, if you're going through puberty, it'll block and stall that process for a little bit and maybe allow you to go through like a different puberty process while you're transitioning. I think that these are all great methods for trans kids and can prevent years of dysphoria, terrible feelings. The science of it is, the facts are that the majority of people who transition do not regret transitioning. Like the large majority, like in the 98%, of people, when people transition, they appreciate transitioning. And a lot of the people who detransition have no problem with transitioning or appreciated the fact that they had that opportunity to express themselves. Obviously, there needs to be a conversation between parent and child. But the problem is there's no scientific analysis towards it or any real conversation with like a real trained therapist. A kid's not just going to say that they're trans and they want to get a gender affirming care surgery, or they want to go on puberty blockers and change their mind in the next second. That is a very unlikely process. And if that is happening, then it's probably because you're a terrible parent who doesn't know anything about your child. So I'd say just organizing around this, we need more political education, right? We need to teach people what is really going on when it comes to gender affirming care with minors. But I really think that can only be won through organizing and high solidarity work. And that political education needs to be interweaved into fighting back against, state and federal laws that oppress trans people. So if you live in a state and the state's trying to pass a law attacking gender affirming care, that's when you need to organize and do the political education, to get people to get out and fight against that bill and fight against that law that's trying to limit gender affirming care for minors. Being a trans person and a minor and having it's more like, not only are they targeting gender affirming care like puberty blockers and other stuff, they're also affecting people's ability to socially transition and just a trans kid's ability to be called by a name that they want to be called, to the point where they're not letting people call kids nicknames in high school or middle school, literally just to be cruel to trans people. Of course, what this is doing is not only is this increasing depression and suicide rates among trans kids, it's also basically creating an environment where kids can bully them and get away with it. You know what I mean? If a teacher already has, discriminatory feelings towards a trans student, or some student already has problems with queer or trans students, LGBTQ plus students, now they know once again that behavior isn't just normal, it's accepted by the administration because they won't even call this trans kid their name. So, it's really creating the most hostile environment possible for trans kids. My heart goes out to all of the trans kids in schools right now, because I cannot imagine legitimately how difficult it was. And it's not like it was difficult when I was graduating either, in 2017 around that time. But the environment has just gotten so much worse in so short of a time, especially in a place like Florida. I can't imagine what it's like to be a trans kid in the South or North and being just openly disrespected for your identity every single day and having to just survive that and wait until you graduate.
Yeah. No, it's a shout out or hugs to those people that need it. I want to ask, so why is the right wing so intense on this? Why are they so why is this their issue? I mean, it seems odd to me, to be honest with you.
That is a great question. I think there are a number of reasons. I'll try to explore 3 specifically. One, trans people could be massively exploited, especially trans people of oppressed nationalities, right? So, when because of the social system and social status that Black people have had to face in the United States society, you can make just so much more profit and money off Black communities, poor Black communities, because you can give them worse jobs for less pay, or do things like put a Dollar General that they have to go to because they don't have access to, like maybe cars or some other situations that people have. That's twice the prices of anywhere else. You can price gouge them, take as much money from them as possible. It's more difficult for them to leave the jobs that they'd like to leave because they're afraid of discrimination at other jobs. They have to face, like racism in the employment process. It's more difficult to, get access to a public school, a high school that'll give them the resources they need to go to a college, in every sector of society, they're oppressed. And for a billionaire who wants to hire based on race, who wants to be able to depreciate everyone's wages by exploiting Black and brown people more, you know what I mean? That's a good thing. And for trans people, I think it just goes doubly so, right? Because like, if you have a trans employee, that's basically like the perfect worker, because they sometimes don't have anywhere else to go. A lot of LGBTQ plus people also make up a large majority of the youth homeless population, right? So those are like people treated at the lowest of the low, who have some of the worst conditions of life. They're struggling to fight to live every single day, and they don't really have a choice over what job they get. They just have to choose what they get and like it. These people can be fired at any time, or brought into the labor force if there's, an accident, or a war where other people have to leave, or for some reason, what the capitalists consider the normal population of society has to leave. They can just bring these trans and queer people in, and then right after they have some other workers to go by, they can fire those LGBTQ plus people, and of course just pay them less in every sector of society. I also think a part of it is because we live in a society where we've seen the nuclear family exist for a very long time. You know what I mean? Like man, woman, children. That's the family unit that has existed. And of course, LGBTQ plus people in general affect that system, but particularly trans people affect that system. And trans women, of course, affect that system as well, since we are women, but, we're not able to get pregnant. I think for people so historically used to those norms governing our country, being a part of how they could exploit these tensions in our country and turn people against each other, trans people represent this dramatic threat to the system that they've created. We see the United States of America going through so much political and economic collapse. And that means they're going to try to go to the true and tried methods to keep order in this country. And I think for LGBTQ plus individuals and for trans individuals, as I've said, particularly, they represent such a threat to that economic system, that base system that people are used to. And in general, I also just think it's a great way to divide working class people and to divide our movements. You know what I mean? A lot of trans people are organizers. I was talking to an incredible organizer in Chicago recently, Joe Isaac Baker, and he made a joke. He was like, I used to see so many, I've seen so many Jewish people in the movement, and I feel like that's reflected now. And, how many trans people I see in the movement. And so, you really do weaken the movement, you know what I mean, by weaken the movement within unions, weaken the movement within our mass movements against police crimes, for Black liberation, for Chicano liberation, for women's liberation, by making it so that trans people are less represented in society and can't organize there. I've organized around police crimes primarily. Most of my work has been around police brutality, not LGBTQ plus rights, even though I fought for that. And, creating the conditions to spread transphobia and chauvinism against trans people makes it so that people aren't willing to unite with us. If workers in a factory are more worried about making sure that a trans employee doesn't get the rights they deserve, or don't care about that trans employee when they get attacked, why should those workers care about a Black employee or a Jewish employee or an immigrant employee? It really creates a wedge within the movement that can be used to separate us, to get people to not understand that our problem is the billionaires and multimillionaires in charge of our country, not LGBTQ plus children or trans people who want the same thing that every working class person wants, to not be exploited and oppressed.
Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head there. I think that this idea of a wedge issue and getting people fighting over these kind of things. I was talking to some activists in the LGBT community in Minnesota, and they were, because I knew I was going to be interviewing you, and they said, Richard, this used to, they used to attack the entire LGBTQ the way they're attacking the trans people right now because they didn't realize, and the response was we need to have people come out, and there was actually a large number of people that are LGBTQ, and as they became more open, people realized who they were. It wasn't some some abstract thing or because of my ignorance. It's actually my cousin Joe or my neighbor or whatever, the guy I work with or whoever, and people and so it had an effect, and it took a lot of the sting out of that wedge issue. And the trans community is much smaller, and so it makes them more vulnerable in a lot of ways. I wanted to ask you about you mentioned a little bit earlier, and I want to dig into it now about the Democratic Party. And there's a debate going on in the Democratic Party, especially at the top, about there was Kamala had these, Trump had these ads, in all the swing states that were like, she's for they, them, we're for you. And, so that it was a sickening Trump ad. And, but some of the Democrats are thinking, hey, we should, maybe we should, pull out, not support trans. We should be LG, we got to take the letter out now, LGBTQ and not have a T. What are your thoughts on that and on the Democratic Party? And then also I'd ask, who do you look to for allies? I mean, the LGBTQ plus community, have they been rallying to, as these attacks on trans people become more sharp?
That is a great question. Well, first and foremost, I think it's complete idiocy. I think, unfortunately, the Democratic Party have this theory, this ideology that they're following to the end, and it's clearly unsuccessful. I think, instead of the takeaway from, losing the election being like, maybe we should have, not been so open and about our support for the expansion of Israel and the genocide of Palestinians. Maybe we should have done something about, police brutality, or connected with more than just abortion rights. And, did more than just say we're going to lower the prices of groceries. Kamala Harris was like literally, condescendingly talking to the Teamsters and to Sean Orr, before her election, saying we don't need you. And they're surprised they lost. Like, come on, like think for 5 seconds. But unfortunately, there is a faction within the Democratic parties that's thoughts are, well, we lost. We need to go more rightward and speak to what more moderate people want, because a lot of the voting base of the people who have that power to vote are those conservative or liberal figures. The truth is the Democratic Party will never truly win those people over. If they do win those people over, it'll be for a very short period of time, and they'll either go back to voting for a Republican or they just won't vote for the Democratic Party or vote at all. For me, I think that it is foolish to think that you can abandon trans people and win rights for the whole LGBTQ plus community. You know what I mean? Solidarity is necessary for victory. And really, they see trans people as the cutting edge to take away all LGBTQ plus rights. They're going for what they believe is the weakest portion of our community before they go for marriage equality, before they make sodomy laws more legal, before they take all queer people's rights away. And so by abandoning trans people, I say you're abandoning yourselves. You're abandoning your own movement for solidarity. And I mean, like, if you look at history and you look at the people who were at Stonewall in those streets fighting for our rights, it was a lot of trans people, of course, because a lot of trans people had nothing to lose. A lot of trans people are the best fighters in so many political movements. There's a quote that I love from Joma. He's a Philippine organizer and revolutionary. And he says the gays are the best fighters. And I very much agree. I think that ultimately the Democratic Party has a choice, right? They have a choice to look to the public and the people's needs and change and adapt to represent the people to be successful, or they have the choice to continue on this path of believing that they can cut off what they call affinity groups and identity groups and move to a more moderate position and ultimately become a failure of a political party that is no longer able to win the consciousness of the people, that cannot rally any people towards them. Unfortunately, I think the latter is probably the choice that they're taking. But I don't think we should insult, every Democrat. It's all about the politics and policies. And whenever there's a progressive individual willing to stand for LGBTQ plus rights, we should fight with them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Let me ask you, I want to move, I think this question of solidarity is critical and instructive because right now it's the trans community. It's also the immigrant community that's being attacked in a pretty ferocious way right now. And, I'm a member of the Chicago Federation of Labor. I'm a delegate. And, I go to those meetings and there's, a lot of staff people, whatever, and lawyers. And they're freaked out about what might happen next, too, because the interpretation of laws and some of the appointees Trump has made. And so I think it's a time for a broad coalition to fight Trump. And so, I want to ask you, from the, I would ask it both ways. One is, why should unions or working class people, care about the trans issue, but then the other side of this too, why should trans people care about what goes on with with Black people or with trade unionists or other sections of our movements as well?
Well, first and foremost, I'll say to answer the latter question, trans people should care about working class issues because the majority of trans people are working class. You know what I mean? They're in your schools, they're in the factories, they're in these unions. And by fighting for working class rights, trans people are fighting for their own rights, especially considering, the fact that it's always conversations about representation. You know what I mean? We want to see trans people in media. We want trans people to be represented. We want them to be valid. That's great. That's awesome. But what about the conversations about the fact that so many trans people are unemployed, that we have no protection from discrimination in the workplace, that the boss is allowed to fire us and get away with it? Where are those conversations happening? Why aren't we taking that as seriously? The only way for LGBTQ plus people and for trans people to win our full liberation is for the working class to win its full liberation. As for working class people need to see the LGBTQ plus issue the same way they see the issue of fighting for the Black Belt Nation, for the Chicano Nation, for oppressed peoples of the United States of America. It's not something you're doing as generosity. It's not just a moral right. It's a political necessity because it's one more movement that you can move towards you that can help us get closer to full liberation, that can help working class people win their struggles. There are so many LGBTQ plus people that are in these unions, that are in these labor movements. And when you are homophobic and transphobic, you push and isolate people away, people who could be fighters in the movements, people who could show up to every union meeting, people who could be leaders. They've done that many times, often in union movements, started making rumors about someone being gay to ruin their credibility and get the union to focus on that instead of for the union to focus on fighting the boss. So it's a great tactic, for them to wedge up against people. And also they can just lie about it too, right? They can be like, this woman's a lesbian. Do you really want to work with her? This person's gay. Do you really want to work with them? I heard this person has a trans friend. Do you want to work with someone who works with people like that? It's an issue that shouldn't be distracting us from the main fight. It's the same thing. Well, although there are different conditions for it, it's the same thing as, like racism on the shop floor and racism affecting the labor movement. You know what I mean? Like, instead of focusing on the people who are really oppressing you, you're worried about Black people taking away your jobs. It doesn't make any sense from a rational point of view. And overcoming that, I think, especially in the American context with where we are right now, I think it's essential for these two movements to fight and unite with each other for us to see like serious progress in this country. And I think these two movements will unite and fight with each other because they're combined.
Yeah. I mean, could you talk a little bit about, some of the history of that? I mean, because I know, some of what you're saying, the most outrageous things are true. Historically, there had to be a a conscious raising amongst people in the labor movement about and breaking down some of the ignorance. But now you see things like Pride at Work, which is a caucus in the AFL-CIO that helps educate and uplift LGBTQ plus issues. So, as could you talk a little bit about how working class and LGBTQ plus people have historically worked?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best to. I'd say my knowledge could be better, but I'll do my best. There's like the Lesbians and Gays for Minors. I believe a member of the British Communist Party was a part of that struggle and was helping lesbians and gays fight for minors' rights and workers' rights. I think you can go back to someone like Leslie Feinberg, who was in the Workers' World Party, and Z's writing specifically on trans and queer history and Z's experience as a working class trans person, and just like constantly leaving jobs because of the discrimination they faced and the oppression they faced. And Leslie Feinberg's experience of finally finding a job where they could work with a labor union organizer who treated them with that same respect and becoming a major fighter and organizer in that union. There's been just so much, I think, struggles against that kind of like repressive attitude in labor unions, and we've seen serious improvement. And in general, when I look at LGBTQ plus history, a lot of LGBTQ plus people, like when subcultures of LGBTQ plus people started to form, they often formed after World War I, because what the United States government would do is they'd get a boat of gay people together. They'd be like, these are the gay ones, and they drop them off in a city together. And so, that was a part of the start of like gay and queer communities, LGBTQ plus communities in the United States of America, especially I think among men. And I think this reality has made it so that, like many queer people are together as working class people struggling and fighting against these things, facing this extra exploitation. I could do more to learn more specifically about the role that that the movement for Stonewall had, specifically among labor unions and rights. But I do know that, a lot of them, like the Gay Liberation Front and other organizations like the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, they supported Sylvia Marsha P. Johnson. They supported their activism and work. So organizations that have wanted to represent the working class people or national liberation movements for justice, they've stood and fought as well with the LGBTQ plus movement.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I would, mention like there's people like Harry Hay, who was, one of the founders he was a former communist, the founders of the modern LGBTQ plus movement, and was active. He was an actor, but he was active in the union and other things as well, organizing people. And but I think for me, I mean, you mentioned Stonewall for sure, and where people stood up and actually fought the police in a toe to toe for several days in New York City. But I think also the AIDS crisis and the way the community responded in the 1980s and into the 90s, whereas governments and people were really just willing to let an enormous number of people die. But the community stood together and stood up and demanded that there be research, that there be and took care of each other and set up facilities to give whatever the technology had in terms of the medical knowledge at the time, and started to demand that people be treated like human beings, and that this is not just something to be snickered at or whatever like it had been for years. And so I give a lot of credit to those people. Anyways, I want to move to one more thing that's starting. It's I feel like I'm going back to the 16th century or something here, but or at least to Nazi Germany. Like talking about book banning, and I'm wondering if you could talk. I mean, you're in Florida, which may be the leading edge of the book banning movement on the right. But could you talk a little bit about what this is and what's going on with this and where it could lead?
So yes, they are banning, LGBTQ plus books in schools, and libraries. They're trying to make it so as difficult as possible, especially for youth, to access LGBTQ plus books, to access books with queer and trans people. This is obviously an incredibly dangerous trend, you know what I mean? And it does harken back to, like Nazi Germany. Like, funnily enough, what people don't know is in Germany, there was actually probably like in its time before obviously the Nazis took power, one of the most forward LGBTQ plus movements, and they even had things like in the 1920s, like passes for people to cross dress. Essentially, at that time, that was passes for trans people to be trans people, right? There was the Institute of Sexual Science that existed that was burned down and destroyed by the Nazis, and they even they literally broke the skull of Magnus Hirschfeld, the creator of the Institute of Sexual Science, and that was like so like sometimes people are like, oh, trans people are a new thing. Yeah, because most of the research about us was literally destroyed. You know what I mean? Like that was data, information that had been collected for years and years and years, just gone to the world. There was no internet in the same way then. You know what I mean? Like that history, those records that they had, all that information they had is gone, and they had to start from scratch. And that same thing without the right political struggle could happen in the United States of America. We're clearly not there yet, though. Right now, I think we're just at a place where like this book banning is a way to try to, I think, suppress the movement for LGBTQ plus people to speak to this kind of like, want to drive a wedge between like the LGBTQ plus movement and working class people, and a way to, like make the populace more ignorant and indifferent about what LGBTQ plus people are facing, so that when we're attacked, working class people don't understand that their rights are being attacked as well. And I want to really emphasize that, because some of the bills against LGBTQ plus people that have been passed have literally affected all working class people. Like I talked about that bill earlier that funds detransitions. You know what I mean? That makes it so that if you transition, your health insurance has to fund your full detransition. So that money would specifically raise the health insurance prices of all working class people in that same way. And I think these book bannings are a way to kind of like try to obscure the issue that's really going on, and to give, the right wing the advantage when it comes to communicating information about LGBTQ plus people. They're throwing really billions and billions and billions of dollars into trying to portray a negative view of LGBTQ plus people, and specifically trans people. And this is another way to kind of like cement that kind of hierarchy and power, and weaken the ability of the LGBTQ plus movement to fight back. So we've got to oppose it through any means necessary.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I asked about the book, banning, but it's like also, I saw down in Florida, it was one of the first places they started attacking critical race theory, which is actually a real theory, but it's not what they attacked. They attacked anything that was like Black history or any kind of, and now it's they're attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion. Which means we should know everybody's history. We should have knowledge, but also we should treat people with treat everybody equally. Can you speak a little bit to the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that fits into what's the attacks that on trans people and LGBTQ as part of a diverse workforce or a diverse school? Or whatever the institution is.
Yeah. For me, primarily the attacks on the diversity, equity, and inclusion are attacks on the gains made from the George Floyd movement, from the 2020s, from the Black liberation movement. Millions of people were brought out, and there were these very minor concessions in reality made to give some democratic rights and demands to Black and brown people, to LGBTQ plus people. And now they're trying to, of course, push back all of these movements, push back all of our democratic rights. And they're kind of also combining the attacks against Black and brown people with the attacks on trans and LGBTQ plus people, and also using the attacks on LGBTQ plus people and trans people to justify attacks on Black and brown people. I'll give you a concrete example. So in Florida, Ron DeSantis basically banned an African-American AP history course, but there was mass outrage against that banning. But then what Ron DeSantis did is instead of banning the entire African American AP history course, he just banned the LGBTQ plus parts and the feminist parts. And a county commissioner of ours, he's progressive on some other issues, but he definitely failed in this instance, named Bill Proctor. He supported Ron DeSantis doing that. He said that was a good thing for him to do. So this is really just an attack on Black history straight out, right? But because he's banning these parts that aren't necessarily as popular with other people, or that some people who might be good on issues of Black liberation, but bad on issues of LGBTQ plus liberation, some people are choosing to support it. But in reality, you're just setting up the conditions for Ron DeSantis to be able to take away the entire AP African American history course, to argue against the entire course, to build a discourse around that, because he's just banning one part for now. What happens when he gets the popularity to ban the entirety of the course? So for me, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it encompasses, some of the few democratic rights and demands we've won from the movement since 2020, and some of the rights that we've won from the LGBTQ plus movement. And now those things are being pushed back. And reality, as I want to say again, it's not a big thing. It really is just giving LGBTQ plus people and Black and brown people some crumbs so that they can survive in a still extremely racist, transphobic, homophobic world. It's not enough for our full liberation and for us to see what we totally deserve. And they're still fighting back against that. So we need to, with whatever power we have, defend these democratic demands and rights and make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion, wherever it is, still exists, because this is a way for them to try to attack and take away every gain from the Black liberation movement, to try to crush the mass movements in their infancy, so we can't build to a point where we can sweep away the systems that oppress us.
Yeah. I mentioned at the top of the show that you're the president of the Tallahassee Community Action Committee. Could you talk a little bit about Donald Trump getting elected, and some of these opening shots he's running, the changes in domestic policy? Has this changed the orientation of that organization at all, or in the way you guys approach stuff on the ground in Tallahassee, or do you think it will? Or could you talk a little bit about what this actually means, having a further right-wing president like this, and whatever the new era that we may be in?
That is a great question. I feel like in Florida, unfortunately, it hasn't changed that much because we have Ron DeSantis in office. And so in Florida, you know what I mean? We have been fighting for community control of the police with the Tallahassee Community Action Committee. We want a Civilian Police Accountability Council. We want, for the people to have oversight over policing. And a bill last year was passed called House Bill 601 that in language made civilian review boards illegal, but actually didn't make the Citizens Police Review Board in Tallahassee illegal, actually. But because we have a lot of conservative Democrats in charge in our cities, nearly every civilian review board in the state of Florida was abolished. And this was before Trump was in office. So we have still been facing, these attacks on our democratic rights and the Black liberation movement. And since Trump has been in office, our organization has launched a few solidarity protests around immigration and around undocumented immigrants and how they've been affected. And we'll continue to be pointing out, the ties and connections between the movement for immigrant rights and the movement for Black liberation, because the same police officers who brutalize Black and brown people brutalize undocumented immigrants, and they're also the same police officers who brutalize LGBTQ plus people. So that's how we've been affected, but I can't lie. I think a lot of people are a lot more shocked than people in the South. Like for me, I can't lie, Trump's election as bitter. I understand people being embittered by it, being angry by it. I see our world, and I see so many places, Palestine in particular, facing so much worse. And I live in the South already, where whether a Democrat or a Republican is president, these same bills attacking our communities would still be passed. So for me, it's just another day. Let's keep organizing, keep fighting. I'm just gonna move forward and not sweat it.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to fight for ahead of us, a lot to win and some to protect. But yes. Anyways, first I want to thank you. This has been I've enjoyed this time, and it's went quickly. So I want to thank you for all the your knowledge and information and wisdom. So the interview is winding down, but I want to give you a chance if there's anything that we haven't talked about here that you'd like to add or to bring up. Now would be a good time.
Yes, there is one thing I wanted to bring up, and you talked about like the international situation and U.S. imperialism, and I also want to talk just a little bit about how like U.S. imperialism also attacks LGBTQ plus people, not just domestically but internationally, with supporting and giving money to these evangelist Christian organizations to go to countries like Uganda, to go to countries in Africa, and promote anti-LGBTQ plus policies and politics, and fight for anti-LGBTQ plus bills be passed. Learning this was like so enlightening to me. You know what I mean? Because we see these, a lot of us are taught to see these countries as, oh, they're just like anti-gay randomly. They just hate gay people and we should be lucky to live in the United States of America. You know what I mean? Because they're so much better around LGBTQ plus rights, or at least that's what people mostly believed before Trump took office. But the United States of America is literally creating this situation. It's literally like a PR thing that they're using against these communities to drive wedges in these communities' solidarity with each other, but also to paint these countries as, naturally more homophobic and transphobic, when the United States itself is a part of the reason why these countries continue these policies, because they're pumping money into them to continue these policies. I think that's something extremely important to talk about, and it just shows how like our fights in our own country for LGBTQ rights are interdependent on the fights for LGBTQ rights in other countries. I also wanted to tell people to come out for International Women's Day on March 8th. We will be organizing a protest around International Women's Day at the Florida Historic Capitol and having a panel and kind of like reading for International Women's Day at the Blue Tavern, which is a place in Tallahassee, if you know of it. But go out to any International Women's Day event you see. Come fight against the attacks on women we've seen in our country, and come stand for what's right.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's good. And just to say, I mean, for our Fight Back Radio listeners, International Women's Day is it's a national day to stand up for working women. It started here in the United States, supporting the textile working women in New York, and likely there's something in your city. That you should check out, or read a book. Otherwise, if you can't find something on, some woman that's made a difference. But if you don't know of in your area anything that's going on for International Women's Day, send an email to Fight Back Radio and we'll track it down for you, because we have some of those connections. But you can reach us at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. But yes, definitely celebrate International Women's Day, and thank you for that, Delilah. I appreciate you bringing that up. But also thank you for being our guest on Fight Back Radio. Really appreciate it.
I was really happy to be a guest. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so here we are. The Trump era is upon us, and they seem to be hitting us from all sides. I saw an article recently where Steve Bannon was cited as saying that's what we do. We hit them from all sides, and the liberals only can deal with a couple of things, and the rest gets through. And it's probably true. I mean, the Democrats are debating right now whether to stand up for the trans people in our society, but we on the left need to do better than that. And I think this gives us some insight, some strategy. We need to build a broad front against Donald Trump that includes everybody. We need to stand up 100% with our trans sisters and brothers, and we need to stand 100% with everybody. Right now, the immigrants and trans people might be up front, but you can see organized labor is getting hit, education's getting hit, our children. The Department of Education may be gone. Higher education may be more difficult for working class people. We don't have time for all the things that they're doing right now. But we need to stand together. And I think Delilah gave us, some insight into that, from a trans perspective. She talked about, things in the Black Liberation Movement and others as well. And so I think we can take a thread from that. And as May Day comes up, we should think about that. And Delilah is probably the perfect guest. Here we are releasing this at the end of Black History Month, and as we're looking at International Women's Day, which was an International Working Women's Day coming up. These are bringing this unity together in the fight against repression and to give power to the people is what we really need. And we say that at the end of each of our episodes here at Fight Back Radio. So anyways, I want to encourage people to, push this episode out there, get it to people, by the usual methods, whatever, subscribe, use social media to get it out to folks, that helps people find us. And we count on you, as we've always said. But finally, I want to thank our production team, which is Natalie Pranis, Dodd McColgan, Shane Tremley, and Vince Olson. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people.